It was November 1944, somewhere in the Hurtgen forest, a landscape that had stopped looking like a forest weeks ago. The trees were splintered to head height. The ground churned into overlapping craters, and a German Oberleutnant named Werner Korte was lying face down in a shallow hole he had scratched out of frozen mud with his bare hands while the world ended 30 meters in every direction. The shells did not fall one at a time. They arrived together, a simultaneous detonation across the entire ridgeline, as if the earth had chosen that exact moment to simply stop existing. There was no warning creak of incoming fire, no time to run, no ranging shot that told an experienced soldier where to take cover. One instant there was a gray November morning. The next instant there was nothing but fire and overpressure, and the particular silence that follows when every man around you has stopped making noise. Korte survived. Most of his platoon did not. When American soldiers found him 3 hours later, wandering along a logging trail with blood in both ears, he said a single sentence in broken English that his captors heard repeated so often over the following months that it stopped surprising them. He said, "You do not fight your artillery, you just die from it." What Korte described in that clearing in the Hurtgen forest, and what thousands of German soldiers described in interrogation rooms and prison camps and the secretly recorded conversations of facilities like Fort Hunt, Virginia, was not simply a powerful weapon. It was a system so conceptually different from anything the Wehrmacht had designed or imagined that German engineers, German generals, and German frontline soldiers all struggled to find language adequate to the experience. They had built what they considered the finest army in the world. They had conquered Poland in 5 weeks, France in 6, and driven to the gates of Moscow before the first serious reversal. They possessed tanks that outclassed their opponents, artillery of their own that was respected across every theater, and a tactical doctrine, the famous Auftragstaktik, that gave junior commanders the freedom to improvise in ways that paralyzed less flexible enemies. None of it prepared them for what American fire direction could do. The story of how American artillery came to terrify even veterans of the Eastern Front begins not on any battlefield but in a classroom at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in the late 1920s, where a group of officers were working on a problem that had plagued every army since the introduction of indirect fire. The problem was time. A forward observer who spotted an enemy formation had to transmit the target's location to the battery. Wait while gunners calculated azimuth and elevation and propellant charge for each individual gun, and then wait again while the guns were physically adjusted before any shells could fly. The entire sequence, under ideal conditions, took between 15 and 20 minutes. In combat conditions, over broken terrain with imperfect communications and the constant interference of enemy action, it took longer. By the time shells arrived, the target had often moved. The officers at Fort Sill proposed an alternative. They called it the Fire Direction Center. Instead of each battery working independently, all firing data would be calculated at a central point by a team of specialists whose only job was converting observer reports into firing solutions as fast as possible. A forward observer with a radio would transmit target coordinates in a standardized format. The Fire Direction Center would compute the data for every available gun and transmit firing orders back within minutes. The system required standardized equipment, standardized procedures, and standardized training across every artillery unit in the Army. It required massive investment in radio communications at a time when most military radios were large, fragile, and barely reliable. But the officers at Fort Sill understood what the investment would buy. It would buy speed, and in artillery, speed was the difference between a target that existed and a target that had moved. By 1941, the Fire Direction Center was standard doctrine across the American field artillery. Every battery commander, every fire direction officer, every forward observer had trained to identical procedures. The system could mass fires from multiple batteries onto a single target in approximately 3 minutes from the moment an observer called in the request. 3 minutes. The technique that most consistently appeared in German prisoner accounts, the one that veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk and the grinding Eastern Front described as the worst they had ever experienced, was something American artillerists called time on target. The mathematics required to achieve it were significant. Every battery firing at a common target was located at a different distance and a different angle. Shells fired from each battery would travel different distances through air that varied in temperature and moisture. Each gun had its own level of barrel wear that affected muzzle velocity by measurable fractions. The time-on-target technique required calculating the exact flight time for every shell from every gun at every battery, and then staggering the firing sequence so that all rounds arrived within a window of plus or minus 3 seconds. A battery located 3 miles from the target fired first. A battery located 1 mile from the target fired last. Every battery fired at precise intervals calculated to the second. When the computation was correct, soldiers on the receiving end experienced not the staggered progression of incoming shells that gave experienced troops time to take cover between explosions, but a single instantaneous catastrophe across the entire target area. There was no incoming sound to react to. There was no pattern to read. German soldiers who had learned to gauge incoming fire by the whine of individual shells and the rhythm of battery volleys found themselves with nothing to read and nowhere to go. A former sergeant in the 2nd SS Panzer Division, interviewed by Allied intelligence officers in the spring of 1945 and quoted in the Foreign Military Studies archived at the National Archives, said that during a time-on-target concentration near Mortain in August 1944, he counted approximately 40 explosions within what he estimated as 2 seconds. He had been in combat since 1941. He had survived Kharkov and the retreat from Moscow and the killing fields around Kursk, where the largest tank battle in history raged for 8 days. He said the American concentration at Mortain was worse than any of it. The numbers behind the American system were figures that German quartermasters could barely process. At Elsenborn Ridge during the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, American artillery units massed behind the northern shoulder of the German penetration fired more than 10,000 rounds on December 22nd alone to stop armored assaults by the 6th SS Panzer Army. Hitler's best-equipped formation, personally selected for the offensive he believed would split the Allied lines and capture Antwerp. The guns did not run short of ammunition the next morning. Fresh supplies arrived before dawn. The 6th SS Panzer Army, which had trained for years and been equipped with priority allocations of Germany's finest weapons, could not move the American line. An American forward observer, typically a first or second lieutenant, averaging around 21 years of age, carried a radio and a pair of binoculars, and had more destructive power at his disposal, reachable within minutes, than a Napoleonic army could have brought to bear in an entire engagement. German commanders learned this through painful experience and described it in the same terms regardless of front, rank, or unit. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had humiliated American forces at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 and initially shared the contempt his colleagues felt for American soldiers, wrote in his papers after the North African campaign that the Americans showed great superiority in artillery and an outstandingly large supply of ammunition. He did not write this as a minor observation. He wrote it as a central explanation for why the campaign had turned. He had entered Tunisia expecting to exploit the weakness he had demonstrated at Kasserine. Instead, he found that within weeks of that humiliation, the Americans had reorganized, retrained, and developed a coordination between their forward observers and their fire direction centers that made offensive maneuver across open ground suicidal. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzerlehr Division, one of the most powerfully equipped German formations in Normandy, a unit that had been built from instructors at German armor and motorized schools, and was considered by Wehrmacht leadership to be virtually the ideal of what a German armored division should be. On July 25, 1944, the opening day of Operation Cobra, approximately 2,500 American aircraft dropped more than 4,000 tons of bombs on a target area barely 4 miles long and less than 2 miles deep west of Saint-Lô. Bayerlein's division was in that corridor. His account, written for the United States Army Historical Division after the war as part of the Foreign Military Studies program, is one of the most cited primary sources in the literature of American combat effectiveness. The long duration of the bombing, he wrote, without any possibility for opposition, created depression and a feeling of helplessness, weakness, and inferiority. Therefore, the morale attitude of a great number of men grew so bad that they, feeling the uselessness of fighting, surrendered, deserted to the enemy, or escaped to the rear. Bayerlein had served in every major theater of the war. He had been Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa and had participated in operations from the lightning conquest of France in 1940 to the grinding defensive battles of 1944. He stated plainly that the American concentration at St. Lo was the worst he had ever seen, not Stalingrad, not the Eastern Front's industrial-scale carnage, the American bombardment in Normandy. The men secretly recorded at Fort Hunt, the facility on the banks of the Potomac that officially did not exist, where hidden microphones in furniture and light fixtures captured what German prisoners said when they believed no one was listening, returned again and again to artillery. The 3,451 prisoners who passed through Fort Hunt between 1942 and 1945 included 15 Nazi generals, U-boat commanders, rocket scientists, and intelligence officers. The operation produced more than 5,000 intelligence reports. What the microphones captured most consistently, across differences of rank and education and branch of service and theater of combat, was a specific kind of dread directed at the speed and accuracy of American supporting fires. A colonel captured after the fighting in the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, where American and British forces encircled and nearly destroyed 2 entire German armies, was recorded telling his cellmate that the single greatest fear among troops on the Western Front was the crackle of an American walkie-talkie. He meant the SCR-536, the 5-pound handheld radio that American forward observers carried into the line. Every German soldier who had spent time on the Western Front understood what that sound meant. It meant a young American lieutenant had identified a position and was reading coordinates into a handset, and that within 3 minutes a volume of fire neither he nor any man near him would survive was on its way. The Germans had excellent radios and excellent gunners. Their 88mm gun, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, had proven devastating against both armor and personnel. Their howitzers were well engineered. Their crews were trained to standards that American artillerists, at the start of the war, could not match in individual technical proficiency. What they did not have was the system. They did not have centralized fire direction that could mass multiple batteries in minutes. They did not have a radio network dense enough to connect every forward observer in real time to every available gun. They did not have the production capacity to expend 10,000 rounds in a single day and replace them before the next morning, because by 1944 German ammunition supply was governed by a mathematics of scarcity that made such expenditure literally impossible. In February 1945, the OKW War Diary recorded that the average German artillery regiment on the Western Front was rationing fire to between 3 and 7 rounds per gun per day. American units in comparable positions were expending between 60 and 100 rounds per gun per day without special authorization. The disparity was not a matter of tactical doctrine or training philosophy. It was the arithmetic of industrial war, and it had been visible to anyone willing to look since 1942. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, understood this better than almost anyone in the German leadership. He wrote after the war that the conflict had become a contest between 2 systems of organization, and that Germany's system, which demanded precision and excellence in individual components, had proven inferior to America's system, which demanded volume, reliability, and coordination among components that were merely good enough. The Sherman tank was good enough. The M1 Garand rifle was good enough. The SCR-300 backpack radio was good enough. The 105mm howitzer was good enough. None of them were the finest examples of their type. All of them were produced in quantities that their German counterparts could not approach and maintained at operational readiness rates that German commanders could only envy, and integrated into a system of combined arms coordination that multiplied the effectiveness of each individual component by every other. The new proximity fuse, which appeared in quantity during the Battle of the Bulge, completed the picture in a way that German veterans described with something close to despair. These shells contained miniaturized radar sets that detected when the projectile was near a solid surface and detonated automatically in the air above it, sending shrapnel downward in a pattern that eliminated the protection of foxholes entirely. Soldiers who had survived years of combat by digging deep and lying flat while shells burst around them found themselves killed by explosions 10 feet above their heads. There was no answer to it. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had designed the Ardennes offensive and commanded German forces in the West, later told Allied interrogators that when he assessed the reasons for German defeat, he placed American artillery and American air power at the top of the list, above strategy, above leadership, above any factor that could be influenced by the quality of individual soldiers or the brilliance of individual commanders. He was describing a system, and his description matched what corporals and privates said in the secretly recorded conversations at Fort Hunt, and what generals wrote in the foreign military studies after the war, and what the man wandering a logging trail in the Hurtgen forest with blood in both ears had said to his captors in November 1944. You do not fight your artillery, you just die from it. The veterans who said this were not wrong, and they were not exaggerating, and they were not trying to find excuses for defeat. They were describing with precision what had happened to them, and what had happened to their army, and what had made the difference between the force that had conquered most of Europe in 3 years and the force that by 1945 was rationing shells and watching supply convoys move only at night to avoid the fighter bombers that owned the daylight sky. They were describing a lesson that had been learned not on any single battlefield, but across 5 years of industrial war, assembled from the experience of thousands of forward observers and fire direction specialists and communications officers and factory workers and engineers who had never fired a gun in anger and would never know the names of the men their calculations had saved. The transcripts that document their testimony remain in archives. The foreign military studies fill shelf after shelf at the National Archives. The recorded conversations from Fort Hunt, classified for 50 years, have been partially declassified and studied by historians who confirm the same themes appearing in conversation after conversation among men who never compared notes and had no reason to coordinate their accounts. They all said the same thing about American artillery, and everything they said was true.